So I'm calling this video Mistakes That Beginners Make in Lightroom, but I know that beginners aren't the only one doing these things, and it's costing you time and it's costing you quality in your photos. So let's get started. Make sure you stick around to the end because I think the last couple are going to surprise you, especially number 6. So the first one right off the bat has to do with the profiles that you have set when you look at your photos, when you just start editing them in the develop module. So we're going to go to the screen and I'm going to show you right here. In this image, this is an outdoor soccer image. It's a sport. I was shooting a soccer game and it's high contrast, bright sun, and Lightroom has automatically chosen the Adobe color profile. And what we have is just kind of, the color is a little weird, but just very high contrast. And we got dark shadows, brights. One thing to remember with Lightroom is that the defaults aren't always the best thing for you, but the good news is that they let you change them. And if you go down here and click on the color profiles, skip all of these that say Adobe because they're not really designed for your camera. Your camera has built-in profiles that you can use, and those are generally going to be better. So look at this one. This is the Adobe color. It's high contrast. The color, the green grass is a little yellow, but I'm going to switch it over to camera flat. And I am a big fan of the flat profiles because it gives you more range, more dynamic range. It kind of brightens up the shadows, prevents you from blowing out the highlights, and you can see it. Just look at the number on the back. Here it's like all white, blown out, but if I switch it over to camera flat, it's not as bad. It's still a little blown out, but we can correct that later on. So you don't always have to use the flat one for a landscape image. You can use the, landscape one. Most cameras are going to have a flat, a neutral, a portrait, a landscape, probably a vivid, and then these monochrome ones. Don't mess around with those too much. There's better ways to do that. But try using the camera profiles rather than the Adobe profiles. That's going to give you a much better starting point with your image. And kind of along the same lines as this, number 2 has to do with contrast. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make when they're editing photos is adding too much contrast too soon. And the reason this is a mistake is because a lot of other things you're going to do with the image, changing the colors, giving some color toning, brightening the photo, darkening the photo, whatever you need to do to correct the image is going to usually add more contrast to the image. Different things you can do throughout the course of editing the image is going to naturally just add contrast. So if you start out with too much contrast, you're really going to get an image that is not very pleasing to the eye once you're done editing it. In fact, I think it's a better idea to look to reduce the contrast when you first start editing the image, and then you can add it in little by little. In fact, the best way to add contrast is by using the local adjustments and adding it only where you want it. So let's take a look at that soccer image again. Let's close out of the profiles. So the first thing I'm going to do with this image is look up here. Remember I said these are a little bit blown out, not as bad as when you use the Adobe profile, but let's knock down those highlights. And right away you can see we're getting much more detail. You can even see the wrinkles in the number here. And if we go up and check the highlights again, now the highlights aren't blown out. And let's even though this is a bright image, and you might say, well, why should I raise the shadows here? Raising the shadows will kind of get rid of some of that contrast, actually give you a much more flat image. And the good thing is here, now you have a kind of a more compressed image here. You look up at the histogram, little hint, we're going to be talking about the histogram in a few more steps. If you look up here, the image is much more compressed. You don't have things, you don't have a lot of pixels all the way over here on the left. You have a few here on the right, but that's going to be these white areas. And now you can play around with the exposure to kind of get that back in the middle. And if you compare that to where we started with really blown out, oversaturated image with the Adobe profile, we got much more detail by reducing the contrast. Now, once we go through this image, you might want to add a little bit of contrast. I would suggest using the tone curve. I think that gives you a little bit better quality. And there you go. And I think that's going to be a much better image than if you started out with the contrast right away. The number 3 most common mistake I see is using too many folders when you're organizing your photos in Lightroom. Using multiple folders actually prevents Lightroom from doing what it's designed to do, and that is organizing your photos. So my suggestion, and this may sound insane to some of you, is to use one folder per year. I do like to break it up per year because that gives you some way to break up the physical file, or, well, I say physical, the actual files in your computer in case you have to archive things or something like that. But don't use separate folders to break apart your photos by anything other than year. Use keywords, use different types of tags, use the metadata of the photo itself to discern it from other photos. So every photo I bring into Lightroom, I make sure it gets some kind of keywording so that I can find it later on. The other way you can find photos, of course, is by date, so that's already built into the photo itself. If you do this, if you just make sure to keyword your photos when you bring them into Lightroom, you're going to be a lot better off. It's going to be a lot easier to find your photos later on. Here's where using multiple folders breaks down completely. Let's say you're on a vacation with your family and you're at the beach and you come up with a great sunset photo, and maybe one of your family members happens to be in that photo as well. Now, when you get home, what folder do you put that in? Do you put that in a family vacation folder? Do you put that in a landscapes folder? Do you put that in portraits because there's a portrait of somebody in there? Depending on how you have your folders broken down, one image could fit multiple different categories. But if you just put everything in one folder, you can keyword it with family vacation. You can keyword it with the location where you shot it. You can call it a sunset photo or sunrise. You can put the person's name. You can call it a landscape photo. You can call it a portrait photo. There can be multiple, dozens of tags that apply to that same photo, and looking for any one of those, you'll find that photo. In fact, you can go into my database right now and type in some of the locations I've been to, and I can just pull up every shot from that location that I've ever shot, because I generally use fewer folders and I use keywords. That's using Lightroom Smart, because that lets you use the power of Lightroom with organizing your photos rather than trying to do it all yourself. Number 4 we already touched on, and that is using the histogram. And the mistake I see a lot of people making is ignoring the histogram in Lightroom. So let's jump into Lightroom and look at this one again. Here I've got a different image. This is a landscape image, and as you can see, we've captured the detail in the sky, but the foreground is a little dark, and I did that on purpose. We're going to talk about shooting for the edit later on, but a little preview there for you. But in this image, first thing I'm gonna do is look at the histogram, and I see that there are areas that are too dark. Obviously, you can see that in the image itself, but when I'm making the adjustments, I'm gonna look at this histogram. As I bring up the shadows, you can see it comes over and spreads out, and those shadows are brightened up. But also, I see that I have some space over here, and I don't have so much space over here. So in this case, I'm going to use exposure and shift that entire histogram to the right, because I know that I don't have to worry about blowing out those highlights, and I can raise up those shadows even more. And now I can go in and look at the highlights here and bring them down, because the sky was pretty interesting with these clouds. So as I move it, you can see the majority of the pixels in this image are kind of right in the middle. That's probably the clouds we're looking at. And by looking at the histogram and using the histogram, you can kind of see where most of the pixels live in your image, and you can make your adjustments to the image while looking at the image, but also ensuring that the histogram is not going too far right or too far left. It's always something you should keep your eye on. It's not necessarily something you have to use exclusively. You should also, of course, look at the image as well, but don't forget to use your histogram. That will make sure that you're not blowing out highlights, making the darks too dark, and it'll keep your image in this nice dynamic range where you're not going to lose detail in the image. Anything that goes too far to the right or too far to the left, and you're going to lose detail. So that kind of goes with reducing the contrast, compressing that histogram to start, and then adding in the contrast later on. Using the histogram when you're doing that, when you're compressing the image and decreasing the contrast, is very helpful. If you like what you're seeing so far, make sure you hit that like button below. It helps more people see the video. Number 5 is sharpening. Some of you are spending way too much time sharpening your images and trying to get them just perfect, especially when you're working with raw photos. We're going to jump into Lightroom and I'm going to show you how to do this real quick. So we're here in Lightroom, and first thing I'm going to do is zoom in, and you can see where the detail is in this image. It's on these petals here. So we're going to go down to the detail panel here. And as you can see, I've got very little sharpening, but here's what I want you to do. Take this radius all the way down to 0.5, and I want you to push detail all the way up to 100. There's a little bit of math going on here, and I don't want to get into the details of why this works, but when you're dealing with raw images, this is something called deconvolution sharpening. And what this does is counteracts some of the softness that you get with a raw image. Raw photos have inherent softness in them, but by this combination of sliders here, moving the detail all the way, or the radius all the way to 0.5, the detail all the way to 100, that's going to give you the right combination you need to correct that in the best possible way. So you don't even have to worry about playing with those sliders, just set them at that. I'm going to go back in, I'm going to show you how to make some more adjustments to get the sharpening exactly where you want it. So the next thing I want you to do is push the sharpening up until you start seeing these artifacts. You can see that right around there. It gets, I hope you can see that on the screen. I'm going to push it up way too much so you can see it. It almost looks like noise, but it's kind of a little, like it gets crunchy. I don't know how else to describe it, but bring it down before it gets to there, and then hold the Alt key, and I think it's Option in the Mac, and just move the masking slider to the right until you only have kind of the edge detail that you want. And I'll tell you that very frequently I end up in the 70s, 80s, or even 90s with this masking, because you really don't need sharpening everywhere. You just need it on those edges, and then you can go up even higher without getting too much of that artifacting. But again, you don't have to go too high on this, so you're not going to be able to see this too well in the video, but I'm going to give you a before and an after anyway. That's the before, and that's the after. Again, you're probably not going to see too much detail once it gets downsampled to 1080p on YouTube. You lose that, but play around with this. But trust me on the radius and the detail sliders. That's where they need to be when you're working with raw files. It's going to save you a lot of time of trying to mess around with it. Number 6 is the one I told you was going to surprise you, and here it is. One of the mistakes that many of you are making is trying to get your photos right in camera. And I put right in quotes because getting a photo that looks good straight out of your camera is probably not the best for editing. And let's take a look at an image to show you what I mean. This is a sunrise photo, and if you looked at this in your camera, you would say it is underexposed. But if you look up at the histogram, you'll see that the colors here, the sun area, is almost all the way to the right of the histogram, which means I've preserved these details. Now, modern cameras, and I say modern, I mean that very broad, because this here is, I don't know, maybe like a 7-year-old camera at this point. It's a Nikon D750. It is a full frame, but full frame cameras in the last 5 years, and really crop sensor cameras as well, and even some of the smaller Micro Four Thirds are just so darn good with recovering shadow areas in your photos that you can actually underexpose, like in this photo, you can underexpose images that just you would think look like they're just way too underexposed. But when you come into Lightroom and you go into the adjustments and raise the shadows, you're going to recover a ton of detail. And I can bump up the exposure and then bring down those highlights. And I've got all kinds of detail still in the sky here. I haven't lost, if you look up at the histogram here, I haven't blown out that detail. And I really, except for right under these benches here, I really haven't lost much of any detail in this foreground. Even when you zoom in, it's very, what I would call high frequency. It's a lot of little blades of grass, and you're really not losing a lot. There's not a lot of noise here. Modern cameras are going to perform very well in shadow areas, but if you blow out these highlights when you take the photo, you're going to have a heck of a time recovering them. You're probably just going to get white spots, and even worse, if you blow out too much of it and you try to bring it down, you'll just get kind of that muddy gray. So getting it right, right out of camera, not always the best idea. Instead, what you should be doing is shooting for the edit. Shooting in a way, and this means learning just how far you can push those shadows in your particular camera, but figuring out what's the best shot that I can edit later on so I can get the most out of this shot. Now, if you're dealing with something where everything is kind of a cloudy day where there's not a lot of dynamic range, there's not a lot of bright brights and dark darks, then you don't really have to worry about that much. You can, shooting for the edit and getting it good looking out of the camera are going to be the same thing. But an image like this, where you have a brighter sky and a darker foreground, you really want to think about how you can edit it later on. And 9 times out of 10, or more than that, 99 out of 100, it means underexposing the foreground or the dark areas and making sure you preserve that detail in the bright areas. So don't get it right in your camera. Shoot for the edit instead. The last mistake that I see all the time, and this one's very common, and that is trying to do too much at once. It's trying to correct color, trying to make it look, put a creative look on it, all kind of at the same time or right after the other. That's a terrible way to do it for a couple reasons. One, it's disorganized, and you're not going to get good results because you're really not sure what you did last and where you're going next. The second thing is, when you don't kind of break it down into steps, it's not repeatable. So you're going to get to another image, you're kind of not going to remember how you did it if you don't have kind of a system to work within. And the last thing, it actually hurts your creativity, because I'm a big proponent of getting the image correct. In other words, fixing kind of the lighting mistakes, or in this case like that last image, bringing up those shadows and getting like a correct looking image, and then working creatively. Once you have that baseline of a correct image, a balanced exposure, adding on the creative looks, color toning, different lighting effects and things like that is going to be a lot easier because you have a good baseline to start with. And I see so many of my students just go crazy with edits right off the bat instead of having a system and being systematic about how they do it. It may seem like having a system is a bad idea because it stifles the creativity, but that's the exact opposite is actually true. Once you have a good system to work within, it kind of gives you the freedom to try new things. So instead of doing everything at once, the solution is having a good system to work within, knowing the steps, taking step by step through the image, knowing what you're going to do next really helps you work more creative and gets you through the images a lot faster. And when you can work faster, you can work on more images and just be able to experience more images, get more practice, and just get better overall. If you do want to learn a great system, definitely check out the Photography Goals Academy. There's 2 parts to that. We go over photography fundamentals, how to use your camera, how to get good exposures. And then we have the Lightroom Masterclass, where I go over things just like this, go over my system for editing photos, There's a number of members in there already. We have a members only group where you can share your photos, get feedback, and I'm in the group all the time. So it's not like you're just watching videos and being done with it. This is kind of an interactive community. That's why I call it the Photography Goals Academy. And if you want to try it out, make sure you check out the link below. You can join for free right now to try it out.